Alright, it's time for a summertime scarefest. The Boogeyman is out, and it's a PG-13 horror. So does that tame down the story, or can it maintain some thrills and chills? High school student Sadie and her younger sister Sawyer are reeling from the recent death of their mother and aren't getting much support from their father, a therapist who is dealing with his own pain. When a desperate patient unexpectedly shows up at their home seeking help, he leaves behind a terrifying supernatural entity that preys on families and feeds on the suffering of its victims. So this stars Sophie Thatcher, Messina, Vivien Lyra Blair, Marin Ireland, and David Dastmalchian. Now, I've been enjoying Sophie Thatcher's performance in Yellow Jackets, so I was curious to see how she'd handle the lead role in this adaptation of a Stephen King short. Now, the whole story revolves around grief, loneliness, and isolation. Thatcher did a really great job at capturing a grieving teenager who is also trying to connect with her dad while also being present for her little sister, and then all while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy that the rest of the people around her expect her to show. I mean, she can be very tough, which is what we want from our hero, but she's also incredibly vulnerable at times, allowing her stoic facade to crumble so that she can succumb to her feelings. The tension that's created between her and her dad, played by Messina, is palpable, but it's also frustrating. There were so many times that we would watch Messina just make a selfish decision because of his own grief, all while recognizing what he's doing to his daughter by ignoring her requests for interaction. That dynamic, it's nice. So when Messina is absent for chunks of time as Thatcher's Sadie just wanders around the house, trying to figure out what's been going bump in the night, it makes a bit of sense that he'd be enveloped in his own tiny world of sadness. Now, even though he's not in this a ton, David Dastmalchian brings quite the presence. If a story calls for quietly disturbed and possibly unhinged with a streak of creepy, Dastmalchian is the one to grab for it. He is amazing in this, and he creates a terrified and exhausted father, somebody on the brink and just looking for a hint of belief from someone to provide him some mental stability. And there's this interaction between him and Messina that devolves just into this whispered conversation. At times it was difficult to hear exactly what was being spoken, but the emotion rang through loud and clear, thanks to the emotive and the expressive bodily presence that Dastmalchian creates. To answer the question that's probably on a lot of people's minds, yeah, there are jump scares. And yes, there are quite a few of them. Did I jump at any of them? Yeah, I did. And funny enough, the first one I jumped at wasn't even a jump scare, but it was just this musical sting. And the fact that I was so intently focused on what was going on that the music jolted me, I thought that was awesome. And there were a couple of other times when the imagery was done just right to get me to react in the way they wanted to. And there were also a lot that the music clued us into a coming scare, so I thought that was kind of a bummer because then I didn't jump. And despite the cliche of jump scares, there was this camera technique that was used continuously throughout the movie that I really appreciated. So much of the time there would be just a very slow pan of the view, sometimes side to side or up and down, or even slowly zooming in on a subject. And I loved the patience that it took to execute these scenes, and also the anxiety that was built because of that. There were more than a few times when the camera slowly pushed in on a dark corner or maybe swept from one side to the other of a hallway, and I was hyper-focused, straining to see just any clue of the boogeyman that might be in the shadows. And it reminded me a bit when I saw The Invisible Man a few years ago. When you stare at something for so long, your eyes begin to play tricks. So I was constantly trying to figure out if there was something to see or if it was just a way to keep my gaze so I could be freaked out on the third or maybe fourth time the camera slowly moved towards a dark area. But there also is a downside to the massive use of slow pans. And even though this is only a 98-minute movie, I did feel the time in spots. Sometimes the patient camera movements slowed the pace too much. There were also times when it felt like a seesaw with the emotions. We'd get all hyped up from a building climax to then almost tranquilized by a complete lack of action, only to be then hyped back up again. Now, I did like how this made about every sequence a little unexpected, but I also wanted the tension to sometimes just continue to grow without being interrupted. Now, I don't know if you've seen the trailer or not, but based on the title, there is a supposed boogeyman. Now, I really appreciate that we're not shown anything related to a being or demon, specter, or even figment of the imagination for quite some time. There is a point where we do get to see some visuals, and I was pretty impressed at what the story provides. Now, the lack of seeing something usually is more unnerving than seeing something because our imaginations typically dream up something way more nasty than what can be created for the screen. And then speaking of nasty, the atmosphere and the set design, they were executed in ways that just started to make my skin crawl. There's a very oppressive and dark tone that's present all throughout the movie, starting from the opening scene where something very horrific happens. It's not only setting the stage for the rest of the uneasiness, but also establishing that this is going to attempt to take us down a very dark path. And thanks to the inclusion of family traumas, the story does get pretty grim at times. Now, it's not so much that it's going to depress you, but the aura of the entire presentation lacks any cheeriness or really even hope. And then with the set design, there's a growing visual that begins to invade the space. Now, I wish it were more developed within the lore to give us more insight into what exactly everything was. But we can certainly infer on some of the imagery that we see that just takes over walls and ceilings. And the lack of light is also used very well. It's a mechanism of the story, but outside of some daylight scenes, the majority of this story takes place in dimly and warmly lit rooms throughout a house. And this creates a lot of shadows and dark corners, which are then perfect for creepy things to hide in. And while this could be very annoying in a real setting, for the movie, it sets the tone wonderfully. Now, I just mentioned that some of the visuals I had wished the lore was more developed on, and this also goes for the Boogeyman itself. We have a very basic understanding of what it is, but it's also conjecture due to the source that's relaying that info to us. And the story does a good job of setting up the creepy vibes, but I think the film would be much scarier and have a larger lasting impact if there were more rationale given to the antagonist of the story. So overall, the Boogeyman creates an ominous atmosphere that delivers apprehension, jump scares, and a fun, if not tame, horror. Sophie Thatcher excels in the lead, capturing an impressive range of melancholy while rising to be the reluctant hero. With wonderful lighting and set designs, the camera invites audiences to squint into the darkness, hoping for a glimpse of a sinister entity before pouncing with unexpected frights. And while the pace does drag at times, and there could be more development on the lore, this is an enjoyable ride that could make your butt pucker from anxiety. There's no sex or nudity, some profanity, and a bunch of violence. I give the Boogeyman 3.5 out of 5 couches. So have you seen any scary movies lately that are worth checking out? Let me know about them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me. Blah!